Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and welcome to Catholic Answers Live on this second day of the new year, and we are indeed live with you today. We had pre-recorded some programming, which we'll play on Friday for the patrons of Trent Horn's podcast. They got to ask all the questions, and so we'll do that Friday because today we thought this is our first opportunity to come back on the air since the passing of Pope Benedict XVI. And the feeling here in this building is one of such gratitude for the life and ministry of Pope Benedict that we did not want to miss the opportunity to devote 2 hours to talking about him. And we thought, let's get people who knew him personally and people who interacted with him, people whose lives were greatly affected by him, as so many of us were. And so we've got just a fantastic lineup of guests to talk with us and to put into context the life and ministry of Pope Benedict XVI. Among them, Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone from the Archdiocese of San Francisco, Archbishop Sample from the Archdiocese of Portland, Bishop Joseph Conley from Lincoln, Nebraska, who has we're really looking forward to talking to because he was in the meetings, so to speak, with Pope Benedict and got to know him personally and to see how he operated. We'll also talk with Jimmy Akin. We'll talk with J.D. Flynn, one of the great greatest Catholic journalists in the world today. And we'll talk with our own Joe Heschmeyer. And we'll continue these conversations as we do open forums and things this week. Tomorrow, Tim will be in, and he wants to talk, of course, about Pope Benedict. But I wouldn't miss a minute of this show because we got some of the best people in the world to talk about Pope Benedict. A really quite striking and by all appearances quite holy death. His last words are reported to us have been, "Lord, I love you." He's a man who said, he was asked one time by Peter Seewald, what would you like to say to Jesus when you meet him? And he said, "Have mercy on my wretchedness." I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember the exact quote from the book, but have mercy on my wretchedness. And he died saying, "Lord, I love you." He lived saying, "Lord, I love you." And if you're expecting a critique of the life of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, you're not going to get it here. It's going to be a celebration and a remembrance of someone who we love. And we loved as a father, and now we love as our brother in heaven. Here to help us with that, Chris Check, president of Catholic Answers. Chris, thanks for being here with us.
Cy, I'm really grateful that you invited me to join you, and I'm grateful that you began with gratitude.
Yeah,
because that's what I feel, and I know the staff here as well. In fact, people talk about where they were when Kennedy was assassinated. I remember very distinctly I was driving in my car when it was announced that Joseph Ratzinger was going to be named Pope, and gratitude. I had to pull the car over because it was just a combination of joy, disbelief.
Right,
I couldn't believe it.
Yeah,
and gratitude. And there's so much we can't even begin to cover it in the next couple of hours.
We won't.
But there's so much for which to say thank you.
Yeah,
in the priesthood of this man.
So much to say thank you for. I have to say personally, and I want to ask you about this. I am a great fan of Pope John Paul II, but I always felt in their writing, and I know that John Paul II is a great writer, and I'm so grateful for all that he did. In their writing, it was much easier for me to relate to Benedict than John Paul II. As a matter of fact, I thought Benedict was one of the clearest, most compelling voices anywhere in the world, not just among Catholic voices. Like you just couldn't stop reading when you were reading him.
Yes, I think that what you have just said there, it certainly accords or resonates with my comparison of the two. There was an accessibility and a clarity in the theology, as profound as it was, and a theology, by the way, informed by just deep learning.
Yes.
I think it was Tony Esolen on the Catholic Thing today who said, the last liberally educated European.
Is that what he said? What a great take, though.
Yeah, something
right.
like that. Of course, a musician, a master of classical languages, but to his writings on liturgy, which for me are the most compelling, although it's all good, but just it's my interest. What knowledge he brought of the anthropology of human sacrifice, for example.
Human sacrifice?
Oh, excuse me. Ritual sacrifice. Humans sacrificing, I should say.
Humans making sacrifice, yeah.
The knowledge that he brought to the anthropology of ritual sacrifice, his command of classical languages, his understanding of the ancient world, all of this he brought to bear on his thought with an accessibility and a clarity.
Do you remember his Regensburg address?
Sure.
And it became so controversial because of maybe a line or two about Islam in there. But what he was attempting at Regensburg was for the church that loved Jesus Christ to engage with the modern world in all of its sort of abandonment of God and say, come back.
Yes.
You've left something that and it really, I mean, it's just one of the great addresses ever given anywhere.
It is a great address, and Cy, it's one of those that for most people, I'm afraid, is going to be confined to not just a misunderstood, but deliberately misrepresented remark about Islam, and it's an unfortunate consequence. They're simply going to miss the essence of, as you have just described it, of that great address. But like so much else of what Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict said, Esselin in his piece on Catholic Thing Today also said, here was a man who could articulate better than they could the arguments of his enemies.
Oh, there's no question.
Like Thomas Aquinas, and yet they would never engage him honestly.
Yeah. I understand that the academics who were actually present at the Regensburg address were quite cold to him. Actually,
Sure.
That he didn't get a warm reception there.
No, the truth rarely gets a warm reception.
Yeah, well, that's probably true. You're probably right about that. Although
from the world, the world.
Here, one of the things I'm really looking forward to asking Bishop Conley from Nebraska,
which, by the way, you call him Bishop Joseph Conley.
Did I say that? Really?
I understand why you did that, because you've got Joseph on the mind there.
I've got Joseph Ratzinger and Joe Heschmeyer coming up later, so I apologize.
I'm sure he doesn't object.
Don't tell him when he comes on.
No, I think he's
him.
Listening right now.
Oh, come on, Chris. Why you have to do that? Our first guest to talk about our recently deceased and beloved Pope Benedict XVI is the Bishop of Lincoln, Nebraska, James Conley.
And dear friend of Catholic Answers.
Before becoming a bishop, he served both as a parish priest and as official of the Vatican Congregation for Bishops. This time of service gave him an up-close view of then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. Bishop Conley was appointed Auxiliary Bishop of Denver in 2008, served as Apostolic Administrator of the Archdiocese of Denver, and then in 2012, Pope Benedict XVI appointed him to the post he holds now, which is Bishop of Lincoln, Nebraska. Bishop James Conley, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Cy, for having me on. It's a privilege.
I'm sorry that I addressed you by the wrong first name. I apologize.
Sorry, Joseph's a good name too.
Okay.
I like that name.
It's all right.
I was born on March 19th, by the way.
Oh, there you go. See?
So it's the feast of St. Joseph.
Yeah.
But my parents weren't Catholic, so they didn't know that March 19th didn't mean anything to them as far as St. Joseph goes. So,
well,
but I take him as like a secondary patron saint of mine.
Okay, good, very good. I'm glad. Well, you're very gracious. Thank you. So I want to ask you about just to start, and Chris and I will go back and forth, probably asking you some questions. But I want to ask you about God's Rottweiler and the public image of Joseph Ratzinger as kind of an enforcer, more or less, of. As a matter of fact, you will actually read in some of the obituaries that he was an enforcer of church doctrine. You know, that phrase will come up. Does that comport?
By the way, that's a good thing for a pope to be.
It's probably all right, yeah.
And especially for someone running the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith.
Well, but Bishop Conley, does that comport with your personal experience when you're in the room with him?
Absolutely not. I mean, anybody who has met Pope Benedict or Cardinal Ratzinger in the days when he was the prefect at CDF knows exactly that knows precisely he's not like that at all. He's a gentle, humble, very serene, calm demeanor, mild-tempered man. So that's just a mischaracterization. And that, it's interesting that leading up to his election, and I know Chris mentioned that, I remember I was in the piazza when the white smoke went up. I was actually in my office at the Vatican when the white smoke went up. And it was just, like you said, the gratitude that. But it was interesting leading up to it was all of that mischaracterization sort of just melted away when he was elected Pope, even though his naysayers continued to tag him like that. But I think his true, who he really was, it really came out at leading up to those. In fact, those last few months of the life of John Paul II, St. John Paul II, the Cardinals, everybody realized that what the media portrayed him as is certainly not who the man was. And I might just preface my comments by saying, I have a personal loss, personal grief for him, because he named me a bishop in 2008 to Denver, and then he also appointed me to Lincoln in 2012. So I feel this special bond. And then having worked in Rome from 1996 to 2006, had a lot of opportunities to be in meetings with him and to meet him on a personal basis. So, it's interesting thinking about it today. We all knew that this day was coming, right? I mean, it was just, he was 95. It's just no surprise, no shock. But when it actually happens, it's like with your own parent. They're going to die someday, but when it actually happens, it's still a shock that he's no longer there, because there was a certain security, even though he was hidden in the gardens of the Vatican praying these past 10 years. The fact that he was alive and there gave, I think, solace and strength and consolation and hope to people. But no, to get back to your original question, no, that was just an unfair characterization of him. He was really just a beautiful, humble man.
So, Your Excellency, you were with Congregation for Bishops, right? Is that when you were in the Vatican?
Correct.
Yeah. So I wonder if there isn't something from that particular experience that you might share with us with respect to the man and his character. Among his legacies, yourself included, are the very fine men he made ordinaries, and for which the Church in America and throughout the world is grateful. But any interaction or story from that time when you were with the Congregation for Bishops?
Sure. I have two stories that I was thinking about today that I'd like to share. I've shared one of them before, but never shared another one. Well, to give you an idea of what his temperament was like, and his holiness and his serenity was, back in the late 90s, we had what we call an interdicasterial meeting. It was when in Australia, general absolution was very, very prevalent, almost in every diocese in the whole country. So the Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, called all the bishops of Australia to Rome for a meeting with 6 different dicasteries in the Holy See, and including the Congregation of Bishops. So I was able to go to those meetings. I was mainly pouring the bishops' water and going around running errands, kind of a gopher. But I got to see him in action, and he had all the bishops of the country of Australia, 28 of them, and dealing with very difficult topics, like basically putting an end to general absolution, which was being done illicitly. He listened to them. He heard what they had to say. He sympathized with them. And then after it was all over, he went in the last meeting and articulated the response of the Holy See in such a beautiful way. So like somebody mentioned today, he was like the Mozart of theology. He not only was able to take in everything, but then he synthesized it and basically gave the conclusion of what needed to be done. And it was just brilliant in such a beautiful, passionate, but also compassionate way that, it was, you could just see the Holy Spirit speaking through him. And that's the way he was at every meeting. He was able to, in different languages too, he was able to hear all the arguments, take them, and then give his conclusion in whatever language he was speaking. In this case, he was speaking English. And just think about that's not even his first language. The other story that just gives you an example of his brilliance and his ability to synthesize the truth in such a beautiful and compelling, lucid way. Another one's a funny story, and it's a mutual friend of ours, Chris, Archbishop Charlie Brown,
Yes.
who at the time he's now the Apostolic Nuncio in the Philippines.
Right.
But at the time he was an official in CDF, and we were living together at the Villa Stritch, and
he became head of the papal household, right?
No, Archbishop Brown.
Right. What wasn't he?
No, he was member of Nuncio in Ireland. He was appointed to Ireland, and then he was in Albania,
right.
And then now he's in the Philippines. So we were all living at the Villa Stritch there, and I was walking across the piazza one day, and Cardinal Ratzinger was coming back from CDF going to his apartment, and I was with actually another friend of ours, Monsignor Tom Fucinaro, and so we stopped him and we said, "Oh, Your Eminence," we introduced ourselves. He kind of knew who we were, but we said, "Yeah, we live with one of your officials, Archbishop Brown," and he said, "Oh, yes." He says, "Charlie Brown. He's a good man, Charlie Brown."
That's very funny. Bishop Conley, we have to take a very quick break. Do you mind if we take a break, and then we'll follow up with more questions for you? Bishop
Absolutely.
Conley from Lincoln, Nebraska, had a long association with our beloved Pope Benedict XVI. We'll ask him some more questions when we come back right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
The leading Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
I want to talk to you about the importance of bringing the news to you every day. And we do that two ways on Catholic Connection. Firstly, we give you a newscast that I write and give to you to keep you up to date on what's happening in the world, in the church. And then we also do interviews daily to help you understand everything from a truly Catholic perspective.
Catholic Connection with Teresa Tomeo. Tomorrow morning, 9 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live, and again, Merry Christmas to you. I think what are we on, the 7th or 8th day of Christmas? I'm not sure, but the show that was supposed to air today, we will air on Friday. For those of you who are, especially those of you who are patrons of Trent Horn, we had a wonderful conversation with Trent Horn, but we're holding that till Friday because we have the opportunity to talk to some wonderful folks who have had various encounters with Pope Benedict the 16th, recently passed, and the funeral will be Thursday coming up, and we'll do an open forum tomorrow. You can call if you've got questions or you want to talk about Pope Benedict. We can do that tomorrow. Today we're just going to talk with our guests, first of whom is Bishop James Conley of Lincoln, Nebraska. Bishop Conley, when you think of Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict, the Second Vatican Council and Pope John Paul II are two inescapable realities in his life. I mean, you can't talk about him without talking about those two. And I want to ask you about both of them. But maybe I could start with the latter, Pope John Paul II. Maybe a word or two about their partnership, what you made of that partnership.
I always saw the two of them as sort of two sides of the one coin. You had this great philosopher, Saint Pope, who came out of Poland, very surprising appointment back in the late 80s, and really led the church as a giant through those post-conciliar years, who had a tremendous impact on the Second Vatican Council. And his primary first confidant was Cardinal Ratzinger. We named him to be the prefect of the most important doctrinal congregation in the church, and they were of the same mind, but they were different temperaments, different skill sets, different personalities. So I always saw them as kind of two sides of one coin. And what I mean by that is that they sort of steadied the ship in those turbulent decades. That's when we came of age. I converted to the Catholic faith in 1975, and so Pope John Paul II was elected shortly thereafter, and so Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict were really the Pope of our generation. And when he was elected, like we talked about earlier, when he was elected as the successor, it was just like you had this great kind of gratitude, but also kind of a assurance, that the church was going to continue on, and that the Second Vatican Council would continue to be unpacked and also interpreted. And that's what I think those two are the key to the interpretation of the Second Vatican Council in all aspects: liturgy, doctrine, morals, all these things. And
that was very annoying to some people. That those two, not everybody liked their interpretation of the Second Vatican Council.
Well, especially in light of the fact that some of the commentators with respect to the synodal way that's underway right now are behaving as if, well, now we're finally going to get the Second Vatican Council properly interpreted, where in fact two men who were instrumental in it had done that.
That work was done. And to some degree there was the quality of having to pull back on the reins a little bit, because there was an energy to those years that was unrestrained and needed. I mean, you can't get to what's good and highest and best with just wild unrestraint. And so there was a quality of those two men kind of pulling back on the reins a bit.
Right. They needed some guidance. I know Newman has this wonderful analogy of whenever a council happens in a church, it's like a spring coming out of the soil. It always savors from the soil from which it sprang. What was the soil of Second Vatican Council? It was the 1960s. And it's not until we get downstream a few decades that it clarifies and gathers force. This was Newman's metaphor for a council. And we saw that happening because it was crazy that first decade. And then then John Paul II started, those great encyclicals, publishing those great encyclicals, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which again, I would include that as a great legacy of Pope Benedict. I don't think that we would have the Catechism of the Catholic Church if it were not his guidance as the prefect. That was really his masterwork, I think, along with a lot of collaborators.
I think your point about councils here, Excellency, is very well taken, and one that I think our listeners need to give some thought to. Our friend, Father David Macconi, the great patristics Jesuit scholar, makes this point. Throughout history, the period that immediately follows councils tends to be a bit of a mess. Things don't get better right away just because a doctrine has been declared at Ephesus, for example, and or earlier, and then all the Arians go away. It is not that way, and yet the Church, as a mother, she takes the long view, and as her children, we need to as well. That is a very well taken point. Another thing, Excellency, that I wanted to follow up on with respect to your first story about his management, Benedict's management of the general absolution problem, and problem indeed it was, and in fact not gone away in some places. Our mutual friend William Fahey has an excellent piece up on Catholic Thing today also, and who teaches at the Thomas More College of Liberal Arts in New Hampshire there. And he makes the point that a lot of people sort of imagine Benedict as this scholar, sitting in his library or at his desk or something like that. But he says all the great minds of the history of the Church, Augustine, Bonaventure, Gregory's a great example. All of these guys were busy with the weariness of travel, with the constant need for diplomatic effort, all of this stuff, and the whole idea that somehow Benedict was a man who had sort of the leisure of his intellectual pursuits. No, he was in fact a manager as well, and your story speaks exactly to that reality.
That's very true, Chris. That's very true, and he, not only was he very busy when he was prefect, he was traveling a lot, giving lectures just all over the world. And he was a man who liked to travel. And then when he was named Pope, well, of course, he had to travel. Right. And that's one of the burdens that he had to carry, which was really very, very heavy on his shoulders. But at the same time, he was able to accomplish great productivity. I mean, just think about that 3-volume series on Jesus of Nazareth. Yes. He wrote those magnificent works while he was in his first years of the papacy. Yeah. And your comparison with Gregory the Great is a good one, because Gregory the Great was the same way. I mean, he wanted to be retired to a monastery like Benedict. Yeah, he was a Benedictine monk, in fact, and yet he was a tremendous administrator. Yes. And I think that Benedict was the same way.
Yeah. Bishop, I think we're about at the end because we got to go to the break now. I don't have any choice. We have to go to the break. But I could listen to you talk, especially about the personal stuff about Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, all day and all night. I really appreciate that you took the time to come and talk with him about us. Thank you very much for the time.
It was a great honor to give this great man this tribute. Thank you very much.
Bishop James Conley, Bishop of Lincoln, Nebraska. When we come back, J.D. Flynn, one of the world's great, as I said, Catholic journalists.
Who used to work for Bishop Conley. Have you enrolled in the Catholic Answers School of Apologetics? Let me ask you a more important question. Do you believe as a Catholic that you have an obligation to share the Catholic faith? In fact, the Church has answered this question, and the answer is that all confirmed Catholics are obliged to share the faith. It's actually in canon law. Catholic Answers is here to help you fulfill that obligation. Our School of Apologetics courses will equip you to help all the people you come in contact with understand what the Church teaches and why. A great place to start is with all the Catholics in your life. Learn the art of apologetics from the best of the best and start sharing the gospel today. Visit schoolofapologetics.com. That's schoolofapologetics.com. Here's a question. Is it really possible to be friends with someone who died 2,000 years ago? Maybe the problem is that we've grown way too comfortable with the story of Jesus. Nice man, right? Taught us to love one another, said not to judge people. We celebrate his birthday every year. It's time to put away this small, safe version of Jesus, says Cy Kellett. Nobody that bland could have transformed the world. In A Teacher of Strange Things, Cy presents Jesus Christ undiluted by sentiment, with all his radical words and deeds uncensored. Do you know someone, your son or daughter perhaps, or maybe your mom or dad, who needs the friendship of Jesus Christ? Do you? Order your copy of A Teacher of Strange Things by visiting shop.catholic.com today or asking for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Did you know you can access Catholic Answers Live right from your phone or other mobile device? Download the Catholic Answers Live app today. The Catholic Answers Live app, available now on iOS and Android.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. And Zach and Darren and John Brasillo all came in to the office today because we really wanted to do – this is our first opportunity to be on the air since the passing of Pope Benedict XVI, and we really wanted to do a remembrance of him, an appreciation of him, and we wanted to ask some of our friends about their take on him. I will continue to say it, one of the best Catholic journalists in the world, certainly – one of the ones that you will profit most from paying attention to is J.D. Flynn, along with Ed Condon. He's one of the founders of The Pillar, which you can find at pillarcatholic.com. I believe after this conversation, I'm not sure of this, but I believe after this conversation, he will be getting into the Pillar private jet and heading off to Rome. I'm not sure about that. Maybe it's not a private jet. Maybe it's the back seat of a British Airways flight. I'm not sure how he's getting there, but J.D. Flynn, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you.
Are you going to Rome?
I am. I'm leaving tomorrow morning, actually. So I'm not taking the private jet, just taking regular plane this time. You know, gas is getting expensive.
Yeah, gas is very expensive.
J.D., I see those fancy bound volumes behind you there. Are those some important church fathers or something? Or are those your bound editions of Mad Magazine? Is that what that is? we lost.
No, we lost the mic. Whatever you just did, your mic just went out. Oh, there you are. You're back.
Sorry.
You're back.
No, I just wanted to know. I mean, couldn't it be both? Maybe it's a little column A, a little column B.
JD, we lost a giant, did we not, in the passing of Benedict XVI?
Yeah, we did. We lost someone who was an extraordinary spiritual figure, an extraordinary leader for the church, an extraordinary churchman, I think, someone who really exhibited the virtues that he espoused, who really lived as a Christian disciple, and who encouraged us to do so in a way that was beautiful. And so it's been to step back and think about who Benedict XVI was and what it was to have been led by him as a Catholic and to have seen the witness of his life is, I think, a real grace and a gift.
I want to ask you, because you are, the Catholic journalist, and I think these questions need to be asked of a hard-hitting journalist. I read some of the obituaries, some of the commentary, some of the Twitter after the passing that will allege that he didn't do a very good job with the sexual abuse scandal, or that he was some kind of cold, hard German. And I apologize to Germans for that, but that's just the way that it gets phrased
right.
here in America.
Yeah.
A German ice-cold theologian who really wasn't very pastoral. What do you make of the critiques first, before we ask you to do an appreciation of them?
Yeah, I think there are things about, first of all, the sort of ice-cold German kind of thing, the sort of God's Rottweiler, as he was called when he was first elected Pope, and those kinds of things. All of that exhibits, to my way of thinking, is that the obituary has been written by someone who didn't read Benedict XVI, listen to him, have any experience with him, or understand him or Catholicism at all. Because, and that's it,
Only that.
There we
go.
Yeah. Right, because this is a person who was perceived to be this sort of hardline traditionalist, but in fact whose theology was, in many ways, whose theological work formed a big part of the spine of the Second Vatican Council, and who was constantly encouraging the Church to more deeply understand what it was to be a Christian at the time of Jesus Christ, in the period of the early Church, constantly encouraging the Church to understand the extraordinary splendor of God's love, and then to understand the extraordinary potential of God's love to work in our own lives, to make of us saints. And so, this notion that Benedict was this sort of person who was stodgy and effete and distant from people just suggests that there was no real understanding among a lot of people of how profoundly Christocentric and I would say, in a certain sense, charity-centric his theological work was. It was extraordinary for precisely that reason. Benedict understood sin. I mean, he famously sort of joked that Gaudium et Spes, one of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, was too optimistic, that it needed a healthy dash of Luther kind of sprinkled in there. So he certainly understood sin and its power, but he also understood, and the sort of central point of his theological reflection was the extraordinary means by which God's grace could not only overcome sin, but could transform us into being able to love with the love of God himself. And so that characterization is, I think, really unfortunate and misunderstands a lot about the former Pope. That's the sexual abuse.
Oh, go ahead, Jay.
Please do the sexual abuse one, because I know many people have that in their mind.
Yeah.
And fair enough. As to the sexual abuse crisis, when Benedict was the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, when he led the sort of Principal Vatican Doctrinal and Disciplinary Office, he pushed during the John Paul II papacy to see sexual abuse treated more concretely as a major crime in the life of the Church. He pushed for the publication of a set of norms that would kind of reserve the treatment of sexual abuse as a crime to the Vatican to ensure that it was handled appropriately. He pushed for bishops effectively to be chastised for not handling these things, and he oversaw the sort of great wave of penal responses, of laicizations to clerics accused of abuse during his time at the CDF. With that said, so Benedict did, as Cardinal Ratzinger, did a lot on precisely that front, and then as Pope continued to do a lot on precisely that front, both sort of legislating to that end, meeting with survivors. I mean, I think what people forget is that when Benedict was meeting with survivors, that wasn't being done. When he came to the United States and met with survivors of clerical sexual abuse at the Apostolic Nunciature, there were bishops who were still afraid to meet with survivors because they had sort of been led to believe that, if you talked with a survivor, then they'd have ammunition to be able to sue you and it would hurt the Church and these kinds of things. There were bishops who were nervous to meet with clerical abuse survivors, and Benedict was a model in this country and around the world of someone who said, no, Jesus Christ comes first, and our pastoral ministry comes before sort of preserving the bank account of the church. We're not going to be worried that every time we talk to a survivor, we're going to get sued. If we get sued, we get sued, but we're going to bring Christ to them. So there are things now that we look back on and we say, boy, these were blind spots of the period. We have learned so much, I think, about the dynamics of power, the interplay between pastoral ministry and sort of positions of authority that we now understand in a different way. I really think that 2018, the McCarrick scandal, the McCarrick abuse of seminarians, the Pennsylvania grand jury report, that gave all of us so much of a different understanding about how especially the abuse of adults really works in the church and how we need to respond to it. And so if we look back and judge every single thing that Benedict did according to the way that we might approach it in 2022 or 2023 rather, he would fall short in some areas.
Okay.
But that kind of judgment, I think, fails to understand how it is that he helped us to get here.
I think
Plus many...
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think that's really well said, JD. I guess the third one, JD, would be that is so much the material for all the obits, and even by people who in the main are admirers. Like there are three I can think of, and I won't name names, but they're all to one degree or another complaining, and I actually think it's a little bit unmanly to complain in public in this way about the resignation. I think actually of a Teddy Roosevelt speech that my friend Dan Kerr, who runs St. Martin's Academy in Kansas, pointed out to me the other day, and it's that speech that Roosevelt gave about there are the people who are in the arena. And they fail sometimes, but they're in the arena, they're in the fight. And then there are the critics, and they're the
Right.
people outside of the arena. And
Right.
this image really comes to mind as I read guys whose work I admire complaining about the resignation with with what I assume is no knowledge of the circumstances. JD?
Yeah, and the thing is, none of us really have a full knowledge of the circumstances. You know, Archbishop Ganswein, who is Benedict's longtime personal secretary, has said that there was more going on with Benedict's resignation than people yet understand. I think we will over time as historians do their work, but I work in the first draft of history, and there's a lot that we don't always get right in the first draft or understand. And so none of us, I think, fully understand the circumstances surrounding the resignation. But what we do understand is that Benedict, when he was 78 years old, before he was elected Roman Pontiff, he had asked John Paul II if he could retire and be an archivist in the Vatican archives. And the Holy Father said, no, you're going to continue in this job. Benedict was a scholarly person who shied away from public life and became the principle of unity in the world's largest church. It was exactly, I think, what the church needed, but it was a heavy cross for him to bear. And we don't know exactly what all was going on. We do know that there were a great deal of scandals and dysfunction which were happening inside the Roman Curia that have now sort of come to the fore that he didn't feel he could handle. We do know that there were elements of his own Curia that he didn't feel he could adequately address to reform. But to say that he shouldn't have resigned, I think, when he made a prayerful, prudent decision about whether that would be the right thing for his own life and for the life of the church is extremely presumptuous. And I think you're right. There's a lot of sort of complaining. Well, we wouldn't have the problems in the church now if Benedict hadn't resigned. Well, we have no idea.
Yeah, how would we possibly know
actually
that?
what we would have in the church right now if Benedict hadn't resigned?
Do you recall?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Do you recall
Yeah.
the news stories came out later about that he was quite badly hurt when he fell in Cuba, and that this was disconcerting to him, that he thought he couldn't travel anymore, and he felt that by not being able to travel, he really couldn't be a modern pope.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
And it does make sense, Sai, and it really brings up something that I'm glad you used that phrase, modern pope, because it brings up something that I think Benedict wrestled with for the whole of his papacy, which was the desire to follow in the footsteps of a man he loved and admired to an extreme degree, John Paul II, but when he himself was cut from a very different cloth and even had a very different idea about what the papacy was. It wasn't because he was a fashionista that Benedict put on the red shoes of the pontificate and all these other vestments. It was because he understood himself as a steward of the mystery. centuries, and he understood the office, the continuity in office, as something much bigger than him. And he really wanted to emphasize that. And at the same time, he followed after someone who was a global icon, and for good reasons. John Paul II decided to be a global icon to take down communism, and we're all glad he did it. But Benedict just had a very different sense of the papacy, and I think was often torn between these two things, both of which he admired, both of which he took seriously, and neither of which he ever felt completely comfortably into.
One element, I would say, of this reality of being a modern pope is the publicity, and it is kind of a double-edged sword. So we find out when Pope Francis gives an interview on an airplane, and it's unscripted, and then we're reading about it in the paper the very next day. But I would say that one great effect of this in both the papacy of Benedict and in John Paul is the reality of how many young men they inspired to the priesthood. And I think that right. and had there not been this reality of, well, let's just say what it is, of being a media figure, being something of a celebrity, and I don't like to associate that word with the clergy, but in effect, this is what happens. A lot of young men might not have been inspired to become priests.
Yeah, that's right. And you can talk to a broad swath of American priests who say that they were inspired by Benedict XVI. And actually, you can talk to seminarians now. I was talking with a group of seminarians, having drinks with a group of seminarians about a week ago, and many of them said that it was the impression of Benedict XVI when they were pretty young, and then encountering his theological work that really kind of impelled them towards priesthood. I teach a class at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park. I think you just had my boss, Archbishop Corleone, on, and I have the guys read Benedict's letter to a young seminarian. I don't know if you've read that, but
yes.
It sketches like a beautiful vision for priesthood in the modern world, and a sense in which an invitation, I think, to young men to really invite themselves to be formed to be the priest that the church needs and the world needs right now. So it's a great text if you haven't read it before.
All right, letter to a young seminarian. We'll look for. I have not read it, but Chris says he has, so I'll look for it. JD,
it was your previous boss we just had on. We're having
you had my previous.
We're having all your bosses on.
Yeah.
All right. Did you ever work for Archbishop Sample? Because he's coming on too.
He's on
I never did, but I saw you've got all these bishops on, and then me. I felt.
We also got Jimmy Akin coming up. Don't worry.
Somebody else with a red beard.
There's some here too. We don't have you for too long, but I do want to ask you this before we go, because you said, as a journalist, you write the first draft of history. The draft is not always
well said.
Is not always correct. It's a draft that will get revised. But place him in history, if you could, for us. I mean, what is your estimation of his place? I'm talking about Benedict XVI, of course. His place in the history of the church, in the history of the big world.
Yeah, I think the thing that we will remember about Benedict XVI is his contribution to the Second Vatican Council, his invitation to the church in the modern world to engage both with early Christian life and thought, with the fathers of the church, with the Scripture itself in a beautiful and profound way, and to try to put all of those things in conversation with the modern world. Benedict ushered in so much of what's happening theologically and pastorally in the life of the church right now. And his papacy, I think there will be people who remember his outreach to Anglicans and Anglicanorum Chedibus. There are people who remember Summorum Pontificum and his efforts towards the traditional Latin Mass. But I think if we really want to drill down on Benedict, it was his profoundly beautiful approach to scriptural theology and the way that has influenced the church so much in ways we don't even yet understand, I think.
So you'll be at the funeral, JD?
Yeah, I'll be there.
All right. Well, we'll be praying for you and for Pope Benedict on that day, and we're very much looking forward to your reporting. Reporting, of course, always in. You can go to pillarcatholic.com to find all of JD's reporting.
We can follow up with JD if you're willing to get up at 1 a.m. and
get up. He's not in bed by 1 a.m.
Get up.
Do you know
That's
JD
when all
Flynn?
the really good reporting happens.
Right.
All right. Well, we'll have you back on.
Just give us a call, but do it from inside a phone booth or something. We don't want to hear the noise of the bar behind you at 1 a.m.
Yeah, right.
All right.
Yeah, glad to give you a very serene update from home.
Okay.
All right, guys.
JD Flynn, God
Safe
bless you.
travels,
Safe
brother.
travels. We appreciate you coming on
guys.
to talk about Benedict XVI. Jimmy Akin next on Catholic Answers Live.
Let us help you with your question today on Catholic Answers Live.
One of the reasons we should go to Mass is because, if you look in the Catechism, you will see the fruits of Holy Communion. And these are remarkable things that we can receive at every Mass that we attend. We encounter the risen Lord, and He shares something of His divine life and love with us.
The Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, live from the EWTN Chapel, every morning, 8 Eastern, on EWTN Radio and Television.
We have a big problem. Our culture is dying, and souls are in danger of being lost. The answer is conversion to Jesus Christ in His church. St. Paul Street Evangelization is a Catholic organization, and we have hundreds of teams spreading the good news throughout the country. But we need your help. The harvest is great, but the laborers are few. Find out more and get involved today at streetevangelization.com. That's streetevangelization.com.
Catholic Answers Live. Chris Check sitting with Cy Kellett, who will be right back. Fear not. He'll be back here in a minute. In this last segment of our first hour, remembering, honoring, reflecting on Pope Benedict XVI, we have Senior Apologist of Catholic Answers, Jimmy Akin, with us. Jimmy, how are you?
I'm doing fine. It's very sad that Pope Benedict is now passed, but, such is the way of all flesh.
Yes, yeah. I think it is, I don't know that we have the hard evidence for this, but I think it's widely believed among the apologists and the folks here in the building that of the apologists, you are influenced and have a particular appreciation of the thought of Benedict XVI.
I do. And to my knowledge, I think that's a fair appraisal of things. I have resonated with the thought of Joseph Ratzinger for a very long time. When John Paul II died, I didn't allow myself to hope that Cardinal Ratzinger would be elected the next pontiff, but he was, and it was like a dream come true for me. I've read large amounts of Pope Benedict. I have both before and after he was Pope. I have a tremendous appreciation for his thought and the scholarship and the general approach that he took to resolving biblical and theological questions. And of all of the 20th century theologians and really of theologians in general, he's the one that I most closely model my own thought after.
In fact, Cy, help me out here. J.D. Flynn observed something very similar to what Jimmy just said in the previous segment, that, of course, there will be people who will be remembering Benedict for reaching out to the Anglicans, for the restoration of the traditional liturgy, things of this nature. I love his work on liturgy just generally. But his legacy as a scripture scholar and his invitation to the modern world to engage scripture in a theological way that he thinks was new. How would you react to that, Jimmy?
Well, he did have profound knowledge of Scripture. He wasn't primarily a Scripture scholar, but a theologian, and that's one of the things that assisted him in his approach and his renewal of biblical scholarship, because during the course of the 20th century, there was a secularizing movement that began in Protestant circles in the 19th century, really a little bit earlier than that. But by the mid-20th century, it had begun to spread in Catholic circles, and there was a kind of let's catch up with the Protestants idea in Catholic scriptural circles, where you wanted to be as secular and skeptical as possible in your approach to Scripture. And there is a value to saying, okay, what could we scientifically prove? But that's a very minimalistic, incomplete understanding of Scripture. And coming from a theological perspective, one of the things that Joseph Ratzinger and then Pope Benedict did was reclaim the faith aspect of scriptural study. So he synthesized the two. He wasn't closed at all to modern biblical ideas and proposals from biblical scholarship, but he wanted to see them balanced with a genuine faith perspective and have the two integrated. So we didn't pit faith and reason against each other in the study of Scripture or in the study of anything else.
Jimmy, it's interesting when you talk about how you had this intellectual and maybe spiritual sympathy with him, because I think of the two of you as similar in this way, and I want to get your reaction to this, that despite the fact that he is, often caricatured as this sort of doctrinaire person, he actually was quite willing constantly to think about old things in new ways, and to not in ways that were discontinuous with the past, but were new, and to legitimately say, well, what do we actually know about that? Which reminds me very much of the way you think about things. Do you think I'm onto something there?
I do. This blurs into my work as an apologist, but one of the things that you find when you look at a lot of early and mid 20th century Catholic apologetics, a lot of it is recycling Thomism. After the Council of Trent, there was a big push towards safety in Catholic circles, and so because the Thomist option was a safe option, you had a lot of theologians and a lot of apologists essentially just repeating whatever it was St. Thomas said about something, as if that settled all the possible questions we could have. And in the course of the 20th century, you started to get pushback from that in theological circles. And so, for example, neither John Paul II nor Benedict XVI were Thomists. Philosophically, for example, John Paul II was a personalist, and philosophically, Benedict XVI was an Augustinian, and meaning he favored St. Augustine. And so while they both had a lot of respect for Thomism, they both went beyond it. And as part of the return to the sources, the ressourcement or ad fontes to the sources movement in Catholic theology, they were willing to go back to biblical and patristic sources and look at them with new eyes and not just repeat a Thomist perspective. And I try to do the same thing. I have loads of respect for Thomism, but I also try to look at things in an open-minded way that is true to the faith, but that is also flexible, and where the faith leaves flexibility. And that's one of the things that I really try to model from Pope Benedict, because he had that same approach. Even though he was tasked as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith with enforcing doctrine, he himself actually personally was very flexible and willing to consider other points of view and see where they did and did not say things that the faith allowed. So he didn't simply repeat kind of the nostrums from the past. He was willing to think about things within the constraints of the faith itself.
And the kind of to continue with the character then is if someone does kind of give him his due, so to speak, but without letting go of that character, they'll say something like, well, he was a liberal, before the Second Vatican Council, and when he went to the council, he was thought of as this liberalizer and later became the enforcer. But that seems wrong to me in this sense, that he never seemed to give up the intellectual adventure of the Catholic faith. He never seemed to say, now I'm in this position at the CDF, I'll just become this kind of rigorous defender of old things.
No, he didn't do that. And in fact, even when he was head of the CDF, even though he was signing the documents, so they were issued in his name that the CDF produced, he didn't write any of them. And he had them written by assistants. And the reason he did that, because he discussed this, he said, the reason I did that is because I didn't want them to just reflect my views. I wanted them to be broadly Catholic. And so he would review them and make sure that they were accurate, but he didn't actually pen them himself lest he forced his own views on others. And similarly, in his trilogy on Jesus of Nazareth, he famously says right in the preface to Volume 1, everyone is free to disagree with me. All I'm asking is for a hearing. I want people to be kind-hearted, but everyone's free to contradict me and debate what I have to say. And rather than just repeat simple ideas from from that would be traditionally comfortable, he made proposals in that were quite striking. Like, for example, he thinks that thought the guy, I'm sure he knows the answer now, whatever it may be, but he thought that the Gospel of John was not simply the product of John, son of Zebedee. He also thought it was that John the Elder had a hand in writing it, that he was the final literary author, and he thought John the Elder was the author of 2nd and 3rd John.
Jimmy, if you had to recommend a work by him, is there one that you love particularly or would recommend to people?
I would suggest people start with his Jesus of Nazareth series. Jesus of Nazareth is the core of our faith, and there's no better way to learn about the thought of Pope Benedict than seeing what he had to say about our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
Not enough time to talk with Jimmy Akin about this, Jimmy, but we'll have you on later in the week, and I hope we can talk about Pope Benedict again.
Sure.
And when we have you on for Open Forum, people can call and ask your views again. But Jimmy, thanks for taking the time with us this afternoon.
My pleasure.
We're taking a couple hours to remember, to appreciate, and to ask those who knew him and were profoundly influenced by him about the work and the life of Pope Benedict XVI. We'll continue that with Archbishop Sample from Portland. Will be next, Darren? All right, up next, Archbishop Sample from Portland. Hang on, we'll do that right after this on Catholic Answers Live. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live on this 9th day of Christmas. I think it's the 9th day of Christmas. I'm not so good with numbers, but whatever day of Christmas it is still the Christmas season. And so Merry Christmas to you and Happy New Year to you. We continue this hour with our I don't know what you would say, remembrance, tribute, assessment, maybe all of those of the life and the ministry of Pope Benedict XVI. We've been so blessed with our guests, and we are blessed again this segment with a wonderful guest to talk about the life and ministry of Benedict XVI. He's the Archbishop of Portland, Oregon. Bishop Alexander Sample. Like many, many fine priests, he's a metallurgist. He's a metallurgical engineer, but ordained a priest in 1990. He was appointed the Bishop of Marquette, Michigan in 2005 by Pope Benedict XVI, and he was appointed the 11th Archbishop of Portland in Oregon in 2013. Archbishop Sample, thank you very much for being here with us.
Well, I'm so honored and pleased to be here to pay tribute to this incredible and holy Pope for the Church.
One of the things that you are known for, and I think that maybe the font of this, at least partially the font of this, is the life and work of Benedict XVI, is the holiness of the liturgy, the power of the liturgy when properly celebrated. Was he meaningful to you as a liturgical reformer?
Quite honestly, my entire liturgical outlook is formed by Pope Benedict XVI. I honestly believe that his writings and his practice of the sacred liturgy will be one of his greatest legacies that will be recognized in time. It began influencing me very, very early on in my life. In fact, this is my original copy of the Feast of Faith, which Pope Benedict and then Joseph Ratzinger wrote in 1981. I began reading this just as I was beginning my theological studies, and so we tend to associate him with the spirit of the liturgy, which is his monumental work and is really his signature work on the sacred liturgy. But it really began earlier than that with the Feast of Faith. So very early on at the beginning of my seminary formation, I began to be formed by the mind and the heart and the spirituality of Pope Benedict XVI around the sacred liturgy. And I think it will be one of his greatest legacies.
Can you help us get past that? I mean, one of the things that you got to do when you talk about Pope Benedict, you get past a lot of caricatures of him. And one of those would be this idea that, well, there's the old liturgy and he's just a guy who was attached to the old liturgy and did everything he can to go backwards liturgically.
No, this is completely a misrepresentation of the mind of Pope Benedict XVI. It really is. Even though he is responsible for introducing a greater ability to celebrate the traditional Mass in the Church, that was not his intent. His intent was clearly, and he said it many, many times, and he said it to me personally, in personal conversation, that his intent was to bring about a reconciliation in the heart of the Church with her past. This whole idea of seeing both the liturgical and the theological development after the Council with this hermeneutic of continuity with the past, that there should be and cannot be a rupture. The Church did not literally hit a reset button at the Second Vatican Council. And so his intent liturgically was to reconcile the Church with her past, because he clearly had seen that there had been a rupture in the Reform. He often would speak of the need for a reform of the Reform. And that was his real intent, was to certainly honor the Second Vatican Council and Sacrosanctum Concilium and the renewal of the sacred liturgy. He was one of the scholars who sought to bring about this liturgical movement, inspired by Romano Guardini. But he wanted it to be in continuity with the past. And so he felt that we needed to recover some of what had been lost in the liturgical reform and recover the sacredness of the liturgy, the beauty of the liturgy. And that was his intent, not to be just a throwback to the past, but to look to the future, but deeply rooted and connected with the tradition, especially the liturgical tradition.
Excellency, in his interview with the Italian journalist that became what Ignatius Press published as the Ratzinger Report, he makes the point that in Sacrosanctum Concilium, there is that phrase in the Latin, I think it's something like participio actuosa or something like that, active participation. And he said this is one of the most misunderstood passages of the document. And he goes on to say that it became widely interpreted as a sort of a need that was felt for a large number of people sort of, to be doing something. And so now we have lots of laity who are looking for work in the sanctuary, and then we have people in the in the nave, and they're moving their arms up and down and this sort of thing. And he said this is missing it entirely.
Absolutely. The whole idea, and remember, he was a peritus, an expert, a theological expert at the council. He is deeply rooted in the council and the meaning of the council. And that whole phrase, that whole idea of full, conscious, active participation of the faithful in the sacred liturgy was meant primarily to refer to the mind and the heart being fully engaged in the liturgical action, not in activity. In other words, those engaged in the sacred liturgy don't need to always be saying something or doing something. It's about entering into the sacred mystery, to be truly, consciously, actively engaged in the action that is happening in the liturgy, the action of Christ in the liturgy. And, there was a recognition that there had been a disconnect, perhaps before the council, where people were not really fully engaged in the liturgical action and plugged in, as we say, and oftentimes doing other prayers and devotions perhaps. And this was the intent of the council, was to re-engage the congregation, the assembly gathered in prayer, with the action at the altar, but primarily mind and heart. That's what full, active, conscious participation meant in the mind of the council fathers.
And in fact, it may be that, a little more silence, in fact, would facilitate that active participation.
Absolutely. In fact, Pope Benedict, in the spirit of the liturgy, even goes so far as to say that perhaps from time to time, even parts of the Eucharistic prayer, the canon of the Mass, could be said silently, as it was in the traditional liturgy, to allow people to prayerfully enter in. I deliberately, even when and he says this in here as well, even when there's no music at the time of the offertory prayers, I say those prayers silently, as he even recommends, because it gives people a chance to pray, enter in spiritually into the action of what's happening, because sometimes we can get too distracted by the words and the actions and always needing to do or say something.
Well, yeah, and in fact, you had mentioned that he's heavily influenced by Romano Guardini, and in Guardini's excellent book on, I think it's called The Art of Prayer, he says, unless you're collected, unless you have collectedness, this is the word that Guardini uses, you can't pray. You have to be collected first, and then silence facilitates that.
Bishop, I do want to take advantage a little bit of the fact that we have you here to ask you about maybe some of your private conversations with Pope Benedict on liturgy, because I know you. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was always a great admirer of his work on the liturgy, and I told him so. And there were many times when maybe just as a brief conversation after a general audience, I would always say to him, "Thank you again, Holy Father, for your work on the sacred liturgy." And he got to know me after a while. And I remember one time I said to him, "I want to thank you so much for the incredible effort and work that you're putting into the sacred liturgy." And he said to me just very simply, in that wonderful German accent in English, he says, "Well, if we don't have the liturgy, what do we have?"
Right.
Yeah.
And then during our Limina visit in 2012, I spoke to him during our audience with the Holy Father about the sacred liturgy, and he launched into a lengthy catechesis on the sacred liturgy, and even on Summorum Pontificum, and why he issued Summorum Pontificum, and this whole idea of reconciling the church with her past. And then in the final conversation I had with him, he granted me a private audience, God bless him, about a year after he had resigned from the papacy. And he gave me 15 minutes to have conversation with him. And I asked him, what is your advice to a bishop in the church today to continue your work in the sacred liturgy? And he said two things. Number one, teach, and give good example, give good example of how the liturgy should be celebrated with beauty, with reverence, with dignity. And that's what he did in his own witness. He taught, but he also showed us how the sacred liturgy can and should be celebrated with that great beauty and dignity and reverence.
What a grace to have 15 minutes with this capital heart and mind.
So you met with him in the monastery where he was living there?
Just outside the monastery. He and Archbishop Gonstein go for a walk in the Vatican Gardens every evening to pray the rosary before dinner. And it was arranged that I would meet with them as they came in from their rosary walk just before they went into the monastery. So we got to visit for a while. I said to the Holy Father, I said, yes, I was going to say you appointed me Archbishop of Portland, and I never got to thank you. So I got the words out. You appointed me the Archbishop of Portland. He says, yeah. He says, you was one of my last appointments. he obviously remembered the appointment.
So he figured, I've done as good as I can do now. I might as well just resign. Could you? We just maybe have you for a few more seconds, Archbishop Alexander Sample of the Archdiocese of Portland, our guest. Just as a person, what was it like to be in the presence of Pope Benedict XVI?
I was always so deeply struck simply by his humility, his gentleness. This caricature, again, that you've been talking about it on this program, this caricature of him of this hardliner, this mean kind of figure, this Rottweiler figure. He was the gentlest, kindest person you'd ever want to meet. And you were struck by the holiness that was about him. I wear the pectoral cross every day that he gave us in that 2012 Ad Limina visit. And I will wear this pectoral cross, I think, for the rest of my life. And as a remembrance of this kind and gentle and holy Pope for the Church.
Archbishop Sample, thank you so much for taking the time with us and sharing your recollections of Pope Benedict XVI.
Well, thank you for doing this program.
And we have to take this break, so we'll take this break, and when we come back, we'll do our very best. We'll have Archbishop Cordileone with it. We'll have Archbishop Cordileone, Archbishop of San Francisco here in California, right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
There's only one Catholic Answers Live.
Are you a coffee drinker? If so, you can now enjoy a coffee roasted to perfection by the Carmelite monks of Wyoming. Delicious Mystic Monk coffee is roasted and prepared by monks in a hidden cloistered monastery and is available in over 25 varieties. All Mystic Monk coffees are works of perfection and labors of love. For more information on how to purchase Mystic Monk coffee, visit mysticmonkcoffee.com. That's mysticmonkcoffee.com.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
One time somebody said to me, why don't you air these people? And I said, no, because I don't think they're Catholic. He says, by what right do you have to say that? I said, I own the network.
Mother Angelica Live Classics. Every morning, 2 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live on this 9th day of Christmas. We're celebrating the life and reflecting on the many contributions of Joseph Ratzinger, later, as you know, of course, recently deceased, and among those whose lives have been profoundly affected by the life and ministry of Joseph Ratzinger. Our next guest, and all of our guests today, this is the highest ranking churchman we will have on with us, and I say highest ranking because that means he was ordained for the Diocese of San Diego, and it's pretty hard to get higher than that. But he also served 7 years in the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura, which is the Church's highest canonical court. In 2002, Pope John Paul II appointed then Monsignor Cordileone as auxiliary bishop here in the Diocese of San Diego. He went on to be the bishop, the fourth bishop of Oakland, California, and in 2012 he was appointed Archbishop of San Francisco. Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone, thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome. Happy to be with you.
When you were in Rome there all those years with the Apostolic Signature, did you have an opportunity to have personal encounters with Joseph Ratzinger?
Not during those years too much. No, I would more like see him in passing, but I didn't have any kind of official encounters with him at that time. I had met him before as a priest, and then, of course, later on as a bishop a couple of times.
And was it he that appointed you the bishop in Oakland?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was Pope Benedict appointed me to Oakland and then appointed me to San Francisco after that.
And we've had so many folks on talking about his many contributions. Maybe I could just start by asking you about what his time as bishop, as cardinal, as pope meant for the life of the church. What is your sense of what all of that meant?
It's hard to know where to start with that. He is a towering figure of a theologian with an amazing breadth and depth of knowledge and insight into our Catholic faith tradition, but also not just like his understanding of it, but his ability to communicate it. He had an amazing ability to summarize volumes of wisdom and teaching in like small pithy phrases, and so many of his writings are writings that are accessible to just about anyone. So it's a brilliant theologian, but then knows how to communicate it. He, of course, he has a great legacy in terms of the liturgy and all of his writings on the liturgy and the way he modeled that with his own life, and him understanding that that's at the heart of who we are as Catholic. That informs everything we believe as Catholics and how we live. So he understood the centrality of that. We can think of his Wednesday audiences. He gave that series of talks on the Fathers of the Church. Of course, being a specialist in St. Augustine, he understood the Fathers also as a force for Christian unity. It's the common roots especially with the East. Yeah, there are so many things to say about the legacy that he's leaving the church for us.
Can I ask you about that last one, Excellency? Because I know from recent conversations that you and I had that you have a good friendship with the Orthodox up there in San Francisco. And I wonder, do you find that is informed by the work of Benedict, that friendship?
It's certainly helpful. Of course, Pope Paul VI started that with the mutual lifting of the excommunication. But I think Pope Benedict's vision of, the early fathers has been a sort of a driving force for our relationships with the Greek Orthodox in San Francisco.
Good. The other thing about San Francisco, and I don't think this is probably news to you, but it's a profoundly secularized city. And one of the things that certainly as Pope and also as Cardinal, that Benedict was concerned about was the loss of God. That it's the quite striking and historically speaking, sudden loss of God in many places. He didn't want to react to that just by lecturing the world, however, that he seemed to want to invite people back to the person of Jesus Christ. That seemed to be the center of what he was about. Does that inform your work there in San Francisco?
Certainly. Pope Francis emphasizes a lot about this culture of encounter, but so did Benedict. He emphasized that our faith is not a series of doctrinal propositions, but it's an encounter with a person. So he emphasized that living encounter with the person of Jesus Christ. Of course, that encounter is mediated through the human encounter, which Pope Francis emphasizes. And I think that's how, if we talk about evangelization, that's how it has to. There's no getting around the personal encounter if we're going to touch hearts with the gospel message of Jesus Christ. So that certainly does inform a lot of what I do in my ministry as the Archbishop of San Francisco.
His concern, it's been speculated, why did he take the name Benedict? And certainly the prior Benedict XV, I'm sure had some influence on him. But I think that's also the sense that he wanted to reach all the way back to Benedict of Nursia, I think, in the original evangelization of Europe. because he wanted to emphasize that, I mean, Europe has really led the world in losing the Christian faith, and that he wanted to not give up on the modern world, the modern secular world, but to somehow embrace that world and kind of do a critique from within it, one that wasn't a critique of, oh, we're over here critiquing you, but from within to say, I'm a modern person as well, but Christ belongs to me and can belong to you.
He certainly was consistently calling Europe to its Christian roots, to recover its Christian heritage, which built up the great civilization that it did. And I agree with you about why he picked the name Benedict. I think it was mostly influenced by Benedict of Nursia. If we think about what was happening in the church and in the world at the time, it was at the end of the Roman Empire. Everything, civilization was collapsing. There was a lot of corruption in the church. And Benedict was very disillusioned with what he saw in Rome. So really the process of rebuilding civilization and then building it in a Christian way. In Europe, it began with Benedict, with forming the monasteries. And it's the monasteries, really, that rebuilt civilization and built up this Christian civilization, a civilization with God at the center, as you were saying earlier, and imbued by Jesus Christ. So I think he probably saw our world in a similar situation with the loss of God and needing to rebuild. And so I would imagine that, yes, but Benedict XV also, given what happened in the world after the aftermath of World War I, there was also, we see a significant step in the direction of loss of God then as well.
Benedict XVI has been a particular inspiration to you, Your Excellency, with respect to sacred music, right? And you've founded this institute named for him, correct me if I'm wrong, for the promotion of sacred music. Develop that for us.
Yes, for sacred music and sacred liturgy. So I named it after Pope Benedict because he's made such a great contribution to the church in this area of beauty and liturgy, and especially with sacred music. And so I wanted to do something practical to recover this beautiful patrimony we have of the sacred art in music and reverence in liturgy. But I think music is really at the heart of it because it just animates so much of our worship. And there's so many treasures we have in that area. And Benedict was calling us to that, and he helped us to, I think, acquire much deeper understanding and theological understanding of the liturgy, not just something mechanical, but its roots, its biblical roots, and the theological significance of it. So he's been such a great inspiration to me, and I know many others in that area. And I think this will be one of his major legacies, is his call for us to recover the sacredness of our liturgical and artistic tradition.
And of course, he was a musician himself.
I believe so. He was a pianist, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
If someone wanted to know more, Excellency, about your work with respect to sacred music, where would they look?
Yes, thank you. They could go to the website, benedictinstitute.org, to find out the latest. We're commissioning new masses. The first one became quite well known now, the Mass of the Americas, even in the secular world of classical music. It was for 2 weeks, now last year, mid-last year, it was #1 on the Billboard charts.
Was it really? Well, congratulations on that. That's Frank.
Frank LaRocca. Frank LaRocca is a composer.
Frank LaRocca, yeah, a wonderful composer.
So the idea is, so again, this is inspired by Pope Benedict. We're commissioning new masses of sacred music they're contemporary in the sense of they reflecting contemporary themes, but they're in the tradition of sacred polyphony, so they have a certain timelessness to it. I often compare it, it's being done musically, what the Franciscan missionaries did here in California, visually with the mission church architecture. You know, when they were trying to evangelize the indigenous population here, they didn't just celebrate Mass in camps and leave it at that. They built churches.
Mm-hmm.
They built traditional Catholic Church, but it also reflects the culture that's here. And they had to use the materials, obviously, the adobe bricks for building, but kind of the colors and the whole style of art. It was a real enculturation of the gospel. And so it's an architecture of a certain time and place, but it also has a timeless beauty to it because it's within continuity of the tradition. So that's what we're doing with the sacred music. So the Mass of the Americas, with the popular devotional song, Starling Guadalupe, the Requiem Mass for the homeless, conveying sense on the streets through sacred music. So these special themes, but they're also in the tradition of.
We have to take a quick break. The Archbishop of San Francisco is our guest, and we're reflecting on the life and ministry of Pope Benedict XVI. We'll continue that, and we'll give a little announcement right after this. The recent decision by the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade was a monumental victory for the pro-life movement. But the fight is far from over. With our new booklet, Why We're Pro-Life, we have produced the perfect tool to prepare you to have peaceful and convincing conversations to shed light on the truth about human life from conception to natural death. Catholic Answers is printing millions of copies of this booklet, and we plan simply to give them away. You can help us in two ways. First, by generously supporting this project. 25 cents prints one book. $2,500 prints 10,000, and so on. Second, by helping us distribute the booklet through your parish, your school, or the pro-life ministry you work with. Catholic Answers is going to blanket the country with why we're pro-life, but only if you step up and help us. Thank you so much. For more information, visit whyweareprolife.com.
Want to know more about the origins of the Catholic Church? Joe Heschmeyer explores the beginnings of Christianity in The Early Church Was the Catholic Church. Joe digs deep into the words and actions of those who lived right after the apostles to refute anti-Catholic claims of how the faith was lived back then. Order your copy of The Early Church Was the Catholic Church today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
As Catholic apologetics have gotten stronger, Protestant responses have gotten stronger as well. And now they have their own answers to rebut the standard Catholic proofs. Don't fret, we've got you covered. In his new book, Meeting the Protestant Response, apologist Carlo Broussard gives well-reasoned biblical answers to Protestant comebacks. Order your copy of Meeting the Protestant Response today at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host, and Merry Christmas to you because we are still in the Christmas season here. Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone is our guest from San Francisco. He was appointed to San Francisco from San Diego. I only say that because, of my profound love for the Diocese of San Diego. But Archbishop Cordileone didn't know this. We just told him at the break, and I probably should have waited to tell him on the air and gotten that reaction on the air. Yeah. But he was chosen by our radio club members and our Society 315 members as the Catholic person of 2022. So we will go back to discussing Pope Benedict, but I didn't want to deny you the opportunity to accept this very high honor, Catholic Person of the Year.
Yeah, I want to assure you, Excellency, this does not come with a cash prize.
Or anything else.
Of any size. Maybe a decent bottle of Napa Cabernet or something.
Well, thank you so much. It's quite an honor for me. It really does come as a surprise. So I'm grateful to you, grateful to all the listeners for confidence in me. And please...
You're an inspiration.
Well, I'll tell you, it'll be even a higher honor when I tell you this. The year before, the winner was Father Mike Schmitz. So you are up there in the pantheon.
Yeah, that's there.
I mean, you've never done Bible in a year, but you've had a lot of other fine accomplishments, Archbishop.
Excellency, all of our guests in the previous hour and in this one have had an opportunity to address the question which is coming up in... all the obituaries on the favorable and unfavorable ones, but undeserved names, the Rat, God's Rottweiler, Benedict's reputation for being sort of a cold German theologian, and all the, which don't really accord with the personality of the man at all.
I mentioned earlier about having had an opportunity to interact with him earlier when I was a priest. I was in graduate studies, and I was living at the Casa Santa Maria, the residence for American priests, graduate studies there. One of the members of the house invited him to speak to us. So that was the first time I saw him personally and heard him speak. And I was just stunned at how different he was from the reputation and the public perception. It was the complete opposite. A man of graciousness and humility. He listens well. He's just like the diametrically opposed to the public perception. And he's a man of great warmth, too. So it's quite, but he has a brilliant mind, and he understands that there is nuance. Not everything is black and white. Some things there are gray areas, and he understands that. But there's also some things are black and white. And so, again, the sense of clarity, the light he could focus on that, but with an ability, a compassion, an ability to listen and understand was truly remarkable.
This kind of caricaturing of him, though, however, as a kind of dark personality, it does seem that you yourself and many of the leaders of the church are you represent something publicly that is quite threatening to some in this who have more secular agendas, and so this kind of comes with the territory for you guys, and by that I mean Pope Benedict, Pope Francis, yourself. You have to deal with the fact that you're not going to be treated with kindness in every news story. You're going to be caricatured sometime, don't you?
Well, sure. I mean, that's not an uncommon thing to be stereotyped that way, but I think it's most of all happened with Pope Benedict. And he also doesn't have that kind of personality that's real forceful, that can kind of break through filters, because he is more on the humble side. But yes, that does go with the train. And I think to stereotype him that way and cast this as the image of him does serve a certain agenda, and I can't help but think that as at least partially is cause for that sort of false stereotype of him.
Yeah, indeed. What did you make of? I mean, you're there in Rome, Pope. You've got these really historic churchmen, really, between him and John Paul II. It's really an extraordinary moment to think. We've lived in a time of people such as this is really quite extraordinary. What did you make of their partnership?
Oh, I thought they were a good complement to each other. And it was just such a great blessing for the church. And for me personally, God gave me this great privilege to have a front seat and all of that. I arrived in Rome for my theology studies in the seminary the day before the installation of Pope John Paul I.
Wow.
So I was there for his death and his funeral. I was in the piazza when John Paul II was elected Pope. I was able to meet him and interact with him on a number of occasions. And then, as mentioned here, Ratzinger speak, and then as a bishop interact with him when he was the Pope. So God really gave me a front seat, and I saw the great vision and depth of these men, and especially their understanding of the Second Vatican Council, what it really means and how we have to read it and what it doesn't mean. And so I saw them really with great minds and great pastoral outreach, getting the church back on a track of an authentic reading of the Second Vatican Council in light of the continuity of the tradition.
And there were real battles, though, in those years in the late 1970s, throughout the 1980s. Maybe that's where some of the God's Rottweiler stuff comes from. But they did have to stand firm in the face of enormous pressure.
Oh, yes, they did. But these were men who were honed at a very dark time in the history of
in their own
Europe.
nations. Yeah.
Yes, with the communism and Nazism, the National Socialism, and the Second World War. So they that world, it was a world of great suffering, but it produced some very strong leaders, and we're the beneficiaries of that.
Well, do you have anything that Pope Benedict wrote that you say, well, if you really want to know the mind of the man, go to this? Is there a favorite that you've got?
Well, it'd be a toss-up between his trilogy on the Jesus of Nazareth series. I think that demonstrates very well his depth of insight into Scripture and his ability to communicate it in a very accessible way. Of course, a lot of us also look to as kind of the Bible for our liturgical guide as his Spirit of the Liturgy, which again, so much in depth into the liturgical traditions and why we do things the way we do, what the theological meaning is. So I would say that those two would be
the trilogy of Jesus of Nazareth and then Spirit of the Liturgy, the great work on liturgy. He wrote Introduction to Christianity. I don't know who he thought he was introducing to Christianity. Like, you have to have a theology degree to understand it. It's hard, but it's like, did you have that sense, Archbishop?
Yes. Yes, I think that was meant more for an advanced theological audience.
Yeah, like you better have gotten an introduction before this.
But it was also earlier on in his career as well, and I think probably over time he developed that ability to communicate it to a wider audience.
So for you, you have the Benedict XVI Institute, and we'll give out that information again, because I do think people should know it. I really hope everyone will listen to the Mass of the Americas and hear the fine work that's being done there, in honor of and inspired by the work of Pope Benedict XVI himself to renew liturgy in a genuine way that wasn't just let's do what they were doing in the 16th century, but was let's recover the full power and beauty of the liturgy for the modern person. You said you thought that would be his legacy, that's kind of what we'll, in the long run, really appreciate about him.
Oh, it was certainly one of them, maybe the great, not the only, but the greatest. Because I find this curious irony that in the secular classical music, the great orchestras play the great symphonies of the great composers. They continue to play Beethoven and Mozart and Brahms, and there are new compositions as well. So the same thing should apply for sacred classical music. The Renaissance polyphony is beautiful in every age. It doesn't get outdated. But there can also be new compositions to add to their tradition. So that's what we're trying to accomplish with the Benedict XVI Institute. And yes, I thank you for saying that. Everyone should hear the Mass of the Americas to see what can be done, especially those who are familiar with Our Lady of Guadalupe traditions,
Yes.
because they'll hear that music and those themes woven all throughout. And so it really is a sort of a Marian unity effort. They can find more information on that at the website benedictinstitute.org. We also find that we try to teach chant too to children. I mentioned during the break our friend Marianne Carr Wilson that does chant camps.
Right here in San Diego.
Teens, and I tell you, it forms a Catholic soul in those young people, and they're going to be Catholic for life now, and they love it.
Yeah, that we have certainly learned that here, where our president sitting next to me here, Chris Check, has encouraged us in the praying of the hours, the church's liturgy, but the chant, the chant that the church that comes out of the heart of the church is formative. It forms the soul, and you're right that those people will be Catholic for life that are formed in this music. So thank you for the Pope Benedict XVI Institute, but also Archbishop Cordileone, thank you for taking this time to remember Pope Benedict with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I think we got, it's a little bit of a step down, but we're going to go to Joe Heschmeyer next. After one of the great churchmen of the American scene today, we'll go to Joe Heschmeyer. But that's what we're going to do. We'll be right back with that right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
It's all about the truth. Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
He was a 10th century saint, priest, mystic, and doctor of the Church, honored as the first poet of Armenia.
Matthew Bunsen and the Doctors of the Church.
Gregory of Narek is revered by Armenians as a watchful angel in human form. His masterwork, the Book of Lamentations, was intended to be his last testament, an encyclopedia of prayer for all nations. He was named a Doctor of the Church in 2015.
For more about the Doctors of the Church, visit doctorsofthechurch.com.
Do you love sharing the gospel and want to learn to be more effective? Join the St. Paul Street Evangelization online School of Evangelization. You will learn to build bridges of trust and make disciples by befriending strangers, proclaiming the gospel, inviting people to the church, and praying with others. We'll ask for a pledge of financial support, but if you are unable to give, we'll give you a membership at no cost. Find out more and get involved today at streetevangelization.com. That's streetevangelization.com.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I'm so grateful for Archbishop Cordileone taking the time. In addition to being the Archbishop of San Francisco, also voted the Catholic of the Year for 2022 by our listeners. Again, so grateful to Archbishop Sample, to Jimmy Akin, who came on earlier, J.D. Flynn, to Bishop Conley. So many personal stories. It's just wonderful. Genuine affection from everybody for Pope Benedict XVI.
Yeah, in particular, Cy, the stories of people, Archbishop Sample's tale of spending 15 minutes with him there after he was no longer Pope there in the Vatican Garden and talking about the liturgy and getting some counsel from him. Very, very moving. All those were great stories.
I didn't know you could ask for 15 minutes with an ex-Pope. If I had known, I'd have asked. I mean, you never know. He might have.
I'm going to say I'm
you
not
don't.
sure.
You don't think? I don't think I would have got it.
Maybe Joe Heschmeyer.
Joe Heschmeyer is our guest. Joe Heschmeyer, of course, apologist extraordinaire, the proprietor of the Shameless Popery podcast, and just a great person to conclude with.
1/3 of the flannel panel.
1/3 of the flannel panel. Joe Heschmeyer, thanks for being here with us.
My pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
So you're a guy who you're an attorney. You go to be a priest. You're in the seminary now, a lay apologist. All of that happened during the time when Joseph Ratzinger or later Pope Benedict was either Pope or Pope Emeritus. This guy must figure in your life in a very large way.
Oh, tremendously. Actually, even before, I've got kind of a funny story. Because in college, when I was first kind of reconnected to the faith in a real and kind of deep way, one of the major issues I'd struggled with was, well, what does the church have to say to contemporary issues like the rights of the poor in third world countries and these things? And so one of the things I was drawn to was what's called liberation theology. And it was really exciting as a young college student. And so I was taking a Latin American history class, and I was doing this essay on liberation theology. And as I'm researching, I submit the first draft of the paper, which is extremely pro-liberation theology, and then two things happen between the first draft and the final draft. The first one is I discovered then Cardinal Ratzinger's Notes on a Theology of Liberation, in which he very charitably but very systematically dismantles what's wrong with liberation theology and shows its weaknesses and shortcomings. And I thought, oh no, I'm going to have to change this paper pretty dramatically. And then the second thing that happened is John Paul II died and Benedict became Pope. And I thought, I'm definitely going to have to change this paper.
I have to change this paper and my life.
Yeah.
Well,
exactly. Well, it very much was the case. It was the beginning of a real love of his theology, of his clarity and lucidity. And just like, he said that he was a man who could speak in paragraphs, where even in talking to him, he was so organized in his thinking that if you said, "What's your thought about this?" he could say, "Well, there's 3 parts to that response, and the second part has 2 parts." And it was just really that, the brilliance and the lucidity of thought. And as anyone who's ever heard me ramble knows, that's not an easy thing to do.
No, it's a striking clarity. I mean, astonishing clarity of expression that can only come from mastery of the thought and the spirit underneath it all. That there's that kind of ability to express things understandably doesn't come from being a simple person. It comes from being an extremely well-educated person, so much so that you've mastered it and can express it simply and directly.
Well, yeah, I'd say even more than that. It comes from a kind of attentiveness, the kind of attentiveness that makes you a good student, but also the kind of attentiveness that makes you really know the other person. Because there are plenty of people who are very erudite, very well read, but they can't organize their thinking in that way or express it in a simple way, human to human, because they're missing that other piece. They might have the information, but there's a sort of human connection. The philosopher Simone Weil talks about this as attention. And I think that's a good way of describing it. A kind of attention to work is study. A kind of attention to the other person is love of neighbor. And a kind of attention to God is prayer. And that there's a kind of underlying theme of attentiveness in the writings of Joseph Ratzinger and Benedict XVI, as well as the interactions people had with him personally, where they were the only person in the room for him. That kind of attentiveness, I think, is a kind of unifying theme to his thought and his work.
I'm going to propose something to you, Joe, and I want to get your take on it. And that is that by the standards of the world, really, he should not be thought of as a doctrinaire conservative, but as a radical. And that he wanted us to live a radically different life than we are living currently in the modern world. That he saw that human beings, that humanity was ill-served by all of this modern stuff. He wanted us more in touch with nature. He wanted us less consumerist and exploitive. He was a wild-eyed radical. What do you make of my thesis?
Yeah, I mean, etymologically, radical comes from radix, root. It's about getting back to the roots of a thing.
Like a radish.
And I think, radishes are so named from the same root. Root word of root. I'd really
root is the root word. Yes.
Why are you derailing?
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead, Joe. Give me your take on the radical Joseph Ratzinger.
I take little derailing. If you think about his work in terms of getting deeper into the Church Fathers, he was very much in kind of the spirit of ressourcement, of like going back to what did the early Christians say about this? How did they approach liturgy? What did they think about that? And so very radical in that sense of saying, if we want restoration, it's a restoration from within, a restoration from going back to the roots. But additionally, also going back to the roots in a very human sense. So he was known as the Green Pope. And so there was this sense of like we've gotten too cut off, not just from our Christian roots, but even from our human connection to nature. And those may not seem like related ideas, but there's this sort of modern sense in which we've become so cut off from our own past and from the natural world in which we live that we live in a kind of modern world of artifice. I mean, if you think about TikTok is the sort of antithesis of Benedict XVI and his very much, like you said, a radical approach because it's ephemeral, it's modern, it's disconnected from anything and everything around it. That's the kind of world against which I think Benedict kind of warns that if you spend all your time in that false world, you're cut off from who you are as an individual, as a species, as a people of God, and that's a real danger. So one of the most beautiful things he proposes is the restoration of what he calls a human ecology.
Tell us about that, Joe.
Yeah, sure. It's the idea that the way we treat the environment...
Well, there's 3 parts, and the second part has 2 parts.
Yes, exactly. So, in Caritas Veritatis, he talks about, or Caritas in Veritate, he talks about this need to see environmentalism and like the pro-life issue is connected. But the way he describes this is that the way humanity treats the environment and the way we treat other humans are interrelated in both directions. And so if you have a culture of disposability, if you treat a fetus or an embryo as just a product for the parents and you toss them, that's going to be interconnected with an approach that says we're going to just fill the world with disposable plastic and disposable products, and everything is single use, and then you toss it. It's this world of plastic and latex in a very real sense. That's a world of the culture of death. It's a world of a culture of disposability. And I think that a lot of social conservatives have been good about attacking things like IVF, sometimes things like abortion, but haven't seen this within this broader modern disconnect from nature, that all these things are actually interrelated, that caring about the environment isn't just some weird new agey thing. You know, people 100 years ago cared about the environment. People 1,000 years ago cared about the environment. They maybe didn't put it in those terms, but they would see the kind of excesses of modernity as kind of abhorrent, and is really a disconnect from the real world, which is a world of nature.
Sai, we've been talking in the past 2 hours a lot about Benedict on the liturgy, and I think it would be a mistake simply to dismiss his thought in that regard as, you know, merely wanting to rescue the Mass from, you know, banal songs or whatever it is. In fact, I think it very much derives from what Joe is talking about here, this Christological ecology, if you will, because Benedict says in his book in liturgy, he says it's in the liturgy that we get our relationship with God properly ordered, and until that relationship is ordered correctly, all these other relationships that Joe is talking about, whether human friendships or our relationship with the natural world, will be disordered unless we get that relationship with God ordered correctly. And it's in the liturgy that that ordering takes place.
Well, that's beautifully said, yeah.
Exactly. Think about the world of Eden. Man is in right relationship with God, with woman, with himself, and with the natural world. All of those relationships, interpersonal, intrapersonal, the relationship with God, and the relationship with the environment or nature, all of those are really harmed in the fall. And we can't just focus on one of those four, but there is nevertheless a priority, and that priority begins with God and flows from there. And so in that sense, like, absolutely, Benedict talks about how, in Spirit of the Liturgy, how you have to start with the liturgy, because he says this isn't just a matter of preference, but he looks at the rule of Benedict in which this is talked about. Like, if the liturgy isn't first and foremost, if you start with neighbor first, if you start with the environment first, you're going to end up in the wrong place. Mm-hmm. But if you start with God first, and you understand from that who you are and who your neighbor is and the world in which you are living, that it's not just a product for consumption, but is a gift from God, not just for you, but to every generation. Well, that changes how you approach God, but it also changes how you view yourself, your own body, your neighbor, the world around you. All of those things are interrelated in a really profound way. Like, there's a singularity of vision that really, in Benedict's thought, you can see in just a glance the connection between the liturgy, the pro-life movement, and environmentalism in a way that you just don't see in 99% of other thinkers, including Catholic thinkers.
But because, is it, Joe, like, could I sum it up in a kind of, I don't think this is simplistic to say it, but he saw it that way because he saw all of those things through the eyes of Christ, that to him the center of it all was the person of Jesus Christ, and the person of Jesus Christ wanted you to know God in nature, wanted you to know God in liturgy, wanted you to welcome the stranger and the infant and the elderly person, that all of it Benedict XVI saw through the eyes of the person of Jesus Christ.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that's the challenge for all of us, and not to be transformed by this age, but to be transformed by the renewal of mind that comes through living in Christ and through Christ. And through that, being transformative in the age in which we're in.
Joe, I'm going to give you the last 15 seconds if you got anything you want to say about Pope Benedict XVI before we close this
I would just encourage everybody to pray for him, even though he's extremely holy. I have little doubt of his final destination. It would be a total malpractice as a Catholic apologist not to say we pray for the dead and then we ask them to pray for us in return.
His last words were, "Lord, I love you. Jesus, I love you."
Amen.
Jesus, I love you.
Jesus, I love you. Let those be my last words.
I know. Let those be all of our last words, and the words that guide us every single day. You know, as he said, that the hope that we have for what's to come makes a difference in how we live today. And I hope that people take that message from him, that this hope is not just a hope for the future, but it's a hope that changes this moment and every moment of life up to that very last moment, a moment he has now experienced. May God welcome him into the kingdom, the good and faithful servant that he was. Joe Heschmeyer, thanks.
My pleasure.
Chris Check, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Si.
And praise God. Thank you, Lord,
Amen.
for the life of Joseph Ratzinger, our former Pope. And we'll see you tomorrow, God willing.